Wrestling is an industry built on the suspension of disbelief. Sure, the characters people play are often real to them, but that doesn't change the fact that this is all still a show. And that's even more so when these characters get fake versions to go along with them. But what are the biggest examples of imposter wrestlers? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the story of the fake Undertaker. Yes, it was in the summer of 1994, after Mark Calaway was seemingly killed off at that January's Royal Rumble following his loss to Yokozuna in a casket match, that a new version of the Dead Man started appearing on TV, with this one being managed by the character's original second, Ted DiBiase. Of course, for anyone paying attention though, it was clear this wasn't the original. No, it was nothing more than a cheap imposter. That said, none of this stopped the $1 Million Man from parading him around like he was the true Dead Man, with this eventually being enough to draw the ire of Paul Bearer, as it would be in the weeks leading up to SummerSlam that he'd return to TV and claim this fake was not long for the world. Why was this? Well, because the real Undertaker was set to return to take him on. Where would things go from there then? Well, the real Undertaker would indeed return at SummerSlam, as the two faced off against each other in what unfortunately turned out to be one of the worst stinkers WWF had ever given us at the time. Still though, even if the match itself sucked, the fake Undertaker, someone who would disappear from TV following this, has remained a nostalgic figure for young fans who were watching at the time, as it was one of the early attempts the WWF gave us of an imposter version of a popular gimmick. And for those who weren't aware, the person playing this imposter was none other than Brian Lee, future member of the Disciples of Apocalypse and real-life close friend of the Dead Man. But what about Mark Calaway's kayfabe brother Kane? Didn't he have an imposter version of him running around at one point too? Why, yes he did, with this being our next subject. Now this one isn't as fondly remembered, as it barely even got out of the starting gates. Yes, it would be in 2006, over a decade after the Phenom had dealt with his own doppelganger, that Kane would have to deal with the same problem. Of course, in his case, it wasn't Brian Lee coming out in a Wish.com version of his gear to confront him on the May 29th episode of Raw that year. Rather, it was future Bullet Club member Luke Gallows. Not that you would have known this if you were only watching on TV though, because we never even got to the point of a reveal before the whole angle was dropped abruptly, presumably for the reason that it just wasn't working. That's right, after that initial showdown between the pair led to the real Kane being freaked out, a one-on-one match would be booked for June 25th's Vengeance pay-per-view, with the idea at the time being that this would merely be round one of a lengthier program. The only problem with this plan, however, was that once the match managed to stink out the joint, it became clear fans were not loving this story. And so, because of that, the decision was made to scrap the whole thing with immediate effect. How would this play itself out on screen? Well, the real Kane would drag his imposter backstage after he beat him, pull his mask off, then throw him out of the building through an emergency exit, with the fake Kane never to be seen again following this. But what about our next subject, or subjects to be more precise? And as it happened, one of these was played by Glenn Jacobs. Yes, it's time for us to talk about the fake Diesel and Razor Ramon. Yes, back in early 1996, Kevin Nash and Scott Hall had decided that, with their payoffs not being where they would have liked them to be, and with WCW offering them some serious money to jump ship, they were going to split from WWF and head down to Atlanta instead. Obviously then this left Vince McMahon with a problem, as he was losing two of his biggest stars at the time. Luckily for him though, he still owned the rights to their WWF characters, Diesel and Razor Ramon. So it was with this in mind then that he came up with the idea to not let these characters end, and instead simply recast them with the future Kane and journeyman performer Rick Bogner respectively. How would this go down with fans? Well, it was not a rousing success. No, quickly seeing through the facade, fans immediately showed their disinterest towards the two when they were introduced on screen by Jim Ross in the summer of that year, for the simple reason that they were just no substitute for Kevin Nash and Scott Hall. Needless to say then, these imposters would quickly fall into obscurity as their TV time grew less and less by the week, with the last time either of them was seen being the 1997 Royal Rumble. But at least Glenn Jacobs would have gone on to bigger and better things by the time 1997 was over, as it was then that he'd debut as the Big Red Machine and start a run which would last for over 2 decades. But what of a one-time tag team partner of his? We're pretty sure he had a brief imposter version of him running around too, and that's why the short-lived fake Mankind is our next subject. Now, when we say this one was short-lived, we mean it, as it was only around for the purposes of one angle. Yes, back in late 1999 and early 2000, Triple H and Stephanie McMahon had effectively taken control of WWF TV after they got married in kayfabe and then ejected Vince McMahon. And trying to make the most of it, the McMahon-Helmsley regime, as they would go on to be known, would make life a living hell for the babyface roster. Obviously, then, one of their biggest targets here was Mick Foley, largely on account of him refusing to bend the knee to his new bosses. Hell, so much would the heels target Mankind here, they'd at one point even cost him his job when they booked him in a pink slip on a pole match, which he subsequently lost. And after that was done, the McMahon-Helmsley regime would further rub salt in the wound by bringing out a fake Mankind on TV who they could parade around to mock him. As to who played this fake Mankind, well, that would be Dennis Knight, someone better known to most fans as Midian. Not that Knight would get to play this role for long, though. No, after only a couple of appearances, the real Mankind would manage to get reinstated, and this would lead to him challenging Triple H to a street fight at the 2000 Royal Rumble with the WWF title on the line. Well, we say it was Mankind who challenged Triple H at the Rumble here, but in truth, it was actually Cactus Jack that Foley metamorphosed into just in time for the fight, presumably because he knew he needed an extra violent persona if he wanted to win that one. And it's just as well he did, because the match which followed was arguably the best one of the entire Attitude Era. As for the fake Mankind, well, he'd disappear quickly following this, with Dennis Knight instead moving on to play the role of Naked Midian before the year was out, all before eventually retiring from the ring altogether and going on to start a second career as a chef. Yes, it was a brief example of a fake version of a character showing up on WWF television, but one which contributed to a great angle and an even better match. But what about the imposter versions of characters who appeared in WCW? After all, there were plenty of them too. And that's exactly why it's time for us to move over to Atlanta for our next entry as we look at the peculiar case of the Renegade. That's right, the only man who could challenge Hulk Hogan's run of dominance as WWF's top babyface star was the Ultimate Warrior. Hell, this even led to the two having an iconic showdown with one another in the main event of WrestleMania 6. And, to the shock of many, in that match it would be the Warrior who won to take home both the WWF title and the Intercontinental title. As you can probably guess then, this was a loss that stuck in Hogan's craw for years thereafter, so when he joined WCW during the mid-90s and that company started bringing in a lot of those other Golden Era stars like Randy Savage and Brutus Beefcake to work with him, it felt like it was only going to be a matter of time until Jim Hellwig made his way there too, and we got the big rematch between the pair where Terry Bollea would get his win back. Needless to say then, when WCW began hyping up the debut of their Ultimate Surprise in early 1995, someone who looked suspiciously like the Ultimate Warrior when seen in silhouette, everyone figured they knew exactly where this was going. That was, until they didn't. Yes, in one of wrestling's biggest bait and switches of all time, it wouldn't be the Ultimate Warrior who debuted uncensored on March 19th of that year. Instead, it would be the Renegade, a budget version of the gimmick if we ever saw one, and one which was played by Richard Wilson instead of Jim Hellwig. Needless to say, this did not go down well with fans. So it was that rather than becoming a player in WCW's main event scene and even getting to challenge Hulk Hogan at one point, the Renegade would quickly slip into the role of mid-card act as he feuded with the likes of Arn Anderson and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff over the television title. That's right, it was the flop to end all flops. And to make matters worse, by the time 1998 came around, the real Warrior would have joined World Championship Wrestling and would be entering into an all-time bad feud with the Hulkster. So this made the Renegade even less relevant than ever. But this isn't the only example of a fake version of a character appearing in WCW over the years. No, before that, we have the exact same thing happening with our next subject, Sting, and his notable doppelganger. How did this one come about? Well, to answer that question, we have to go all the way back to 1996, the time when the New World Order had arrived in Atlanta and were taking over the whole show. Back then, you'd be hard-pressed to find a babyface who could stand up to this heel group. Hell, many on the roster were actually choosing to join forces with the Invaders instead. And this meant everyone had suspicious eyes on them as people waited to see who would defect next. One person few could imagine defecting, however, was Sting, and that's why it was such a shock when, in September of that year, he appeared to turn on his on-screen best friend Lex Luger after coming out of an NWO limousine. Did this mean what we all thought it meant? That Steve Borden had gone to the dark side? That was certainly what the babyface side of the locker room believed. In the end, though, it would be revealed that this was not the case. No, instead, the NWO had hired a fake Sting to attack Luger on that night in order to make it look like the good guy had gone bad. And once the real Sting was able to show the world this, he decided this wasn't a fight he wanted a part of anymore. Why was this? Well, he couldn't deal with the fact his friends hadn't trusted him. So because of this, he'd spend the next year and a half removing himself from the proceedings as he sat up in the rafters, watching what was going on to his company from a distance. As to what happened to the fake Sting during this time, the one played by Jeff Farmer, well, he'd continue to work for the company, albeit now under the name of NWO Sting. And NWO Sting would, as it happened, have a decent amount of success in his own right. Sure, he'd never reach the heights of Steve Borden or anything, but he would carve out a nice run for himself as a mid-card heel, with him at one point even getting to venture over to Japan for a while to be a part of that company's branch of the New World Order. But let's move away from him for now and back over to WWE for a while, as it's there we find our next example of a fake version of a character, the case of the Bella Twins and their twin magic. Yes, we're not saying that either of the Bella Twins are a fake version of the other here exactly. No, both are very accomplished in their own rights. After all, in the case of Brie Bella, she's a former Divas champion and someone who has since gone on to become a mogul outside of the ring with her work in the fitness industry. And as for her twin sister Nikki, well, she's also found success in these outside endeavors, all while also being a two-time former Divas champion and someone who's just made an in-ring return at the 2025 Royal Rumble. Back in the summer of 2008, though, many fans didn't know there were two of them. No, back then, a lot of people would have only known Brie Bella, a fresh new rookie who had recently joined the company. But pretty soon it would become clear that there was more to her than met the eye, as pretty regularly during her matches, when she was at her most beaten down, she'd disappear under the ring, only to come back out again a few moments later seemingly fully revived and ready to get the win. So what was going on here? Well, as it would eventually be revealed, there were actually two Bella sisters. And whenever Brie was going under the ring, it was her identical twin sister Nikki who was emerging, fresh as a daisy and with a clear advantage over her opponent. Obviously then, this led to them scoring a lot of early victories by dastardly means. And when this deception was unveiled, the babyface roster of the women's division was not happy about it. But they wouldn't have to be upset for long, because now that the ruse had been rumbled, there would be no more examples of twin magic, at least not without WWE now being fully aware of what kind of tricks the sisters were trying to pull. No, now both Bellas would hit the ring together more often than not in tag team matches, and that would start a run for them which would last for several years and would see them eventually be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2020. So while you could argue their initial tactics were certainly underhanded, it did work out for them in the long run. It's just a shame those same tactics didn't work out quite as well for our next subject in the long run then, Doink and all the fake versions of him over the years. That's right, while the original and best version of Doink might have been played by Matt Bourne, he was far from the only person to wear the face paint over the years. No, at least a dozen people have done this across various different companies. And the first notable example of a fake Doink making an appearance happened at WrestleMania 9. What took place on this show? Well, during his match with Crush, Bourne would get one over on his opponent when, toward the end of the bout, an imposter version of him, played by Steve Kern, would come out from under the ring, twin magic style, and help to lay out the babyface so that the heel could get the win. But while that moment was certainly memorable, it was far from the only time an imposter version of the clown would feature inside of a wrestling ring. No, once Matt Bourne was fired, numerous other people would pick up the mantle in the years following, with perhaps the most famous one being Ray Apollo, the man who became the second full-time Doink in 1993. Even outside of him, though, there were plenty of others, with some of the names who donned the face paint at that point including Steve Lombardi, Mark Starr, and Ace Darling. And that's not even getting into the Doink impersonators who have appeared in one-off cameo appearances following the character's initial removal from TV, either for the purposes of getting in their opponent's head or just to give a fun moment for the audience. Those names include people like Jeff Jarrett, Chris Jericho, and Nick Dinsmore. And if we want to get technical, the mini versions of Doink also count as fake versions of the character too, meaning not only is Dink applicable for this video, but also Pink and Wink as well. But all of this is to say that the nature of the Doink character being hidden behind clown makeup has made it very easy for imitators to take up the role over the years, and for fans to mostly buy into it whenever this happens, as it's not so obvious as having a fake Diesel or Razor Ramon running around. So in many ways, the WWF are lucky they had the character dressed the way he did in the first place, as it's given the whole thing more longevity than it ever would have otherwise. Sadly though, the same luck cannot be found in our next example of a doppelganger version of our character. No, in the case of Cara and his fake equivalent, both of these would have a very hard time in WWE. Yes, in early 2011, Luis Alverde, better known in Mexico as Místico, would make his debut for WWE under the new gimmick of Cara. Unfortunately though, Cara's style was never able to really translate to WWE, and this led to him quickly struggling to get over with not only fans, but management too. So much would he struggle, in fact, when he was busted for a wellness policy violation soon thereafter in July of that same year, a new person would be brought in to play the Cara gimmick, with this new person being Jose Rodriguez, someone who also confusingly went by the name of Místico at one point down in Mexico. And that would lead to a situation where, once the original was able to return to the ring again, there would be two versions of the same gimmick running around the halls of WWE. How would WWE deal with this situation? Well, in true wrestling fashion, it would have to be settled in the ring. That's right, at that October's Hell in a Cell, the pair would have a one-on-one blow-off bout with each other. The only problem with this, though, was that with Rodriguez also struggling to adapt to the WWE style, the match which followed wasn't much to write home about. And so it was that the tale of which one of these people was the real Cara fizzled out, with one of them simply changing their name to Único and moving on from the whole situation. That was, of course, until the original Cara left WWE altogether a few years later, and Único once again found himself working under the mask. Yes, it was a very confusing time, and one which was made all the more confusing by the fact that the two men were under masks for so much of it. But let's move away from that storyline and on to our next entry instead, the time that during late 2010 SmackDown, a fake Eric Rowan appeared on TV. What was the situation exactly? Well, it all took place in the summer of 2019. That was the point Rowan and his then tag team partner Daniel Bryan became involved in a storyline with Roman Reigns. You see, at this point, a mystery attacker had been targeting the big dog for a while, and after questioning the locker room to find out who might be responsible, Roman was informed by Buddy Murphy that the man in question was none other than the former Wyatt family member. Obviously then, when confronted about this, Rowan denied any such wrongdoing, and his tag partner Bryan was by his side here, with him at this point demanding he'd get to the bottom of the situation. What few could have imagined at this time, though, was that the American Dragon getting to the bottom of the situation would result in him unveiling the person he believed had carried out the attacks a couple of weeks later, with this being, well, a guy with a shaved head and a beard. Yes, it appeared here that this was someone who just so happened to look like Eric Rowan, and so the whole thing had been a case of mistaken identity. However, this would soon lead to yet another swerve, because not long after this, it would be revealed that Rowan had indeed been the attacker all along, and this led to him turning on Bryan. That's right, this was all effectively just a roundabout way to turn Daniel Bryan babyface again. But let's move away from WWE again for a moment, because it's in TNA that we find our next entry. And this one is a little bit more lighthearted, as it's a tale of a shark who became human, who became a rattlesnake. Who are we talking about here? Why, Shark Boy, of course. Sure, John Tenta may have taken up the shark gimmick first, but he wouldn't be the most memorable person to do such a thing in wrestling, because it was in the late 90s that Dean Roll began portraying the comedy part of Shark Boy on the North American indie circuit, with the idea here being that he was a shark who had at some point decided to become a wrestler. Yes, we know wrestling is a weird place. As time went on, though, and Shark Boy became a member of the TNA roster, it became clear the Ohio native was going to have to tweak his gimmick if he wanted to have more longevity, and that's what led to him making the truly odd decision to turn it into a Steve Austin parody in 2008. No, you didn't hear us wrong, the comedy shark gimmick had now evolved to aping Stone Cold himself. How did this happen? Well, after falling into a coma after apparently taking one too many shots to the head, the babyface would wake up on the January 17th, 2008 episode of Impact, now believing that he was indeed the Texas Rattlesnake. Needless to say then, this led to him coming out to the ring in a leather vest, all well rather than drinking a beer, he would enjoy a nice cool clam juice instead. And when he wasn't doing that, he was letting us all know in his best Steve Austin impression that he was there to raise shell. And that if fans were behind him on this, all they needed to do was give him a shell yeah. Yeah, it was a crazy gimmick, but a fun one nonetheless, and it served its purpose of freshening up the Shark Boy character and allowing him to enter into a tag team with the mysterious Curry Man, someone who, as legend goes, may have had some kind of affiliation with the fallen angel Christopher Daniels at some point. How would their tag team run go? Pretty well. Sure, they'd never win the gold or anything, but they'd always be an entertaining duo to watch. And the Shark Boy Stone Cold parody would continue to live on even after this was done, as fans clearly hadn't had enough of it yet. Really, the only negative we can say about Stone Cold Shark Boy is that it didn't stick around long enough for Steve Austin to return to the ring and have a match with him, because what a sight that would have been. And what a bizarre way it would have been for the Rattlesnake to come out of retirement after all those years. But we guess that's the strange appeal a fake version of a character can have in wrestling, as all the other examples we've looked at today have shown.